The sea beat itself senseless against Dragonstone, each wave throwing a handful of shattered stars against the black teeth of the shore. Jon stood where the wind could take the wet through his cloak and into the bones, and he let it. The cold was an old friend, clean and uncomplicated. The rest of the world was not. Behind him, in the lower yard, the hound cursed at a box with iron bands and 4 hand-sized windows, each shuttered and latched, as if a piece of night had been nailed up for storage. Every so often the wood shuddered. Every so often something inside remembered its old hunger. "You keep it nearer me, I'll throw it in the sea," the hound bellowed, straightening and hawking into the wind. Backward fools hauling a dead man to visit lords and ladies. Davos slipped from the stone stair with the air of a man relieved by motion. He tucked his hands beneath his arms. "The point, Ser Sandor, is that we show them. Words are wind and worse. People don't believe ravens anymore." "The point," the hound said, tapping the box with the toe of one boot until it jolted in reply, "is that this should be ash. It's a wicked thing keeping it on a leash." "The world is full of wicked things," Jon said quietly, still watching the surf. "We don't get to decide that. Only what we do about them." The hound sniffed, eyeing Jon's profile as if he'd said something obtuse and therefore possibly dangerous. "You going to tell your queen you mean to drop in on every lord from here to Dorne carrying her pet in a crate?" Jon turned. "I'll tell her we've tried truth the easy way. It's time to try the hard way." "You want hard," the hound began, but his glance flicked beyond Jon's shoulder and died into a silence that had reverence in it, if only grudging. The dragons did not announce themselves so much as arrive, the air bending around their weight and wing. Drogon banked and rose, sparks of spray skeletonizing the membranes of his wings as he climbed, and Regal dipped and let out a sound like old leather torn in a great hurry. Daenerys came down the slope with Tyrion 3 steps at her heel, and Yora loitering like a shadow unwilling to be far from her feet. Even in the wind she moved as if its business had nothing to do with her. She smiled for none of them, and it was no discourtesy. It was a queen's full attention turned to a single subject. "Is there anything left of it?" she asked. "Too much," the hound muttered. Tyrion's eyes darted toward the box, away, back again. "If I may be the voice of caution, your grace." He cut himself short as the Wight's hand, only the fingers like the ribs of an old umbrella, scraped suddenly against a shutter. "May I instead be the voice of reasonable, honest fear? This is a terrible idea." "It's the right one," Jon said. He did not press her title into it. The only thing that felt like flattery from his mouth was a lie. "We show the North first. Winterfell, the Vale, the Riverlands, the Reach. Dorne if they'll receive us. Stormlands, the Iron Isles if we can find any who don't answer to Euron. Then King's Landing. By the time we face Cersei in the Dragonpit, no lord in the 7 kingdoms can call it a mummer's show." Daenerys weighed him with her eyes. Tyrion looked at her. Yora looked at her. The dragons rumbled and stared at no one at all, as if bored of human arrangement. "You'll go without me," she said at last. "Drogo?" The name died on her lips, changed itself. "Drogon and Regal and I will be too much for every castle gate between here and the end of the world. They will say it's all another trick. They will talk of threats." "Let them," Yora said softly. "No," Daenerys continued, and the single syllable laid a path. "Jon will go with Ser Davos. Ser Sandor keeps the box because he hates it. People trust hatred when it's honest. Lord Tyrion, you'll ride south to arrange a meeting with your brother, if he will come. Show him if you can. Ser Yora, go with Jon and keep him whole." Gendry, the young man, who'd been lurking half behind Davos as if he could make his blacksmith's frame small with good manners, straightened. "Your Grace, you know Storm's End?" she asked. "My father's castle," he said before he remembered himself. His mouth worked. "Robert Baratheon's. I know it from a distance. Some houses in the Stormlands still recall the Baratheon name with more than caution," she said. "Go, show them what we face. Use the name if you must, but not the throne." Gendry blinked as if she'd struck him with something made of velvet. I'll go, your grace. And me? Tyrion asked thinly, lifting one slender eyebrow. Meet with my brother and hope he is unarmed and unambitious in the conventional Lannister style? Daenerys' smile was there and gone. Take Bronn if you can find him, and a dozen men who know how to run. Davos took in the plan with a sailor's quick mapping of currents and wind. Winterfell first, he repeated, more to himself than to them. Aye, it's a start. Best keep the thing in the crate until we're ready. Best keep the fire near. At the word fire the hound's mouth tightened, but he spat and nodded. I'll keep it, he said. I'll keep it, and I'll keep cursing it until the end of the bloody world. The beginning felt like moving a quiver full of arrows around a fire and calling it strategy. But Jon knew the North. You started the thing that needed starting, and you kept at it until something broke in your way or you did. They loaded the crate aboard a longboat and a longboat into a hull with a mended keel. The sea rose up and tried to eat them and failed and tried again. The hound slept sitting with one booted foot braced against the box. In the mornings the frost crept down the rope lines and made them glitter, and the deckhands joked too loudly. On the second night Davos found Jon away toward the bow chewing on sleep that wouldn't come. It'll work, Davos said, because sometimes a lie serves a man better than a tender truth. If they don't believe, nothing will, Jon said. If they do, we'll run out of time. Davos squinted into the dark. The hard part is the same as it's always been. How much of your word you can spend without becoming poor. You told her you bent the knee. Your sister won't like it. It was the right thing. Aye, and she'll like that less. The first white gulls of the winter shrieked them into Wight Harbor under a noon sun like pale milk. The sea wore a crown of ice in the hollows. Lord Manderley sent out men in green cloaks and a semblance of honor guard. Jon wore furs that smelled like the north of his childhood and went up the wide steps with Davos at his shoulder, and the hound swearing as he and 4 men coaxed the crate along with ropes and care. They didn't show it to the Manderleys. Not yet. They took bread and salt first and sat by a fire that crackled high and hot enough to make the hound go silent and sullen. Davos talked trade winds with Wyman's younger son, and Jon listened to the old man's breathing, each breath a wheeze and a rattle like coins in a heavy purse. You'll want a convoy upriver, Lord Wyman said. There've been raiders since the Freys lost their wits. If you can call what they had wits to begin with. Raiders we can live with, Davos said. We'll pass your thanks to them on our way. They rode to Winterfell 2 days later in a snow that quilted sound and hid the land in the way Jon had loved as a boy. The towers rose out of that whiteness like old gods. Jon had to stop a moment at the sight. He hadn't wanted to. There are places that hurt you to look at anything more than the ground between your boots. Sansa stood in the yard in a cloak the color of a raven's throat, the fur at her collar catching snow like sugar.
Arya ghosted beside her, bareheaded, unbotered.
Bran sat in a chair with wheels he did not seem to notice, his face without hunger or ease. Jon Royce was there, broad and grounded as a standing stone, his bronze plates like autumn leaves hammered to armor. The northern lords formed a half-circle, wool and leather and beards rhymed with clean frost. Jon dismounted and Sansa's face changed and did not. He wanted to take her hands. He did not. They stood another heartbeat pretending to be wise. Sansa, he said. Your Grace, she said. And her eyes told him that the title was a game now with pieces moved while he was away. A Wight in a box? She asked after they had made it through too many words about roads and ravens and sea. You've brought the worst truth home like a wedding gift. If we're to live through the winter, they need to see it with their own eyes, Jon said. He turned so that he spoke to all of them. I swore it to the Queen. And there it was, the flinch like a dropped plate. To Queen Daenerys. I swore I would bring this to King's Landing. Before I do, the North has to see. The Vale. All of them. I will not have Southerners telling you what is true. You bent the knee, Lord Glover said. The words thrown like stones, each one a bruise. You bent the knee we gave you. I bent the knee to save the North, Jon said. The same reason I took it. We need her. We need her dragons and her armies. We need all of them. The North remembers, a woman's voice said. from behind Lord Manderley's grandson, from beneath a hood of gray. Lyanna Mormont had a way of making every word feel like a charge. But the living don't sit in memories to keep warm. Show us. They took the crate to the great hall. A ring of men with spears stood as if holding a circle against wolves. Near the hearth a trough had been laid to hold coals. Fire ate them lazily, and every time the hound glanced at it you could see him seeing something else behind his eyes. Jon drew a breath that tasted of pine smoke and iron. He nodded to Sandor. "Ready your torches," the hound said to the two men nearest the coals, and when their hands shook he looked at their faces and that steadied them. He put both hands on the top of the crate. "Don't run," he said, almost conversationally, to no one and everyone. Then he slid the iron bar free and threw the shutters up like a gambler showing his hand. The thing inside had once been a man. Came out like an argument you'd already lost. Hands first, fingers scrabbling, teeth exposed. The split in its cheek showed somebody else's dried blood along the gums. It lunged and the chains bit like hungry steel into what passed for wrists. And the sound it made had no words in it at all. There were no speeches that could have accomplished what followed. Men who had never seen war made the noise men make when they have to pretend to be brave for the first time. Men who had and hoped never to remember how remembered. Jon Royce stood like a wall, and you could see him calculating whether bronze would be any different if a dead thing fell on it. Sansa tasted the fear and did not look away. Arya took a step forward, nowhere near enough to be danger, and then another. Bran's gaze did not change, and for a moment Jon wondered whether anything ever would stir there again. "Hold," Jon said. The word was for the men with the torches and also for his feet, because there's a part of a man that wants to jump into a river just to have it done. Arya moved sideways like a cat and watched the Wight's weight in its chains. When it twisted, she slipped behind it. Fast as a blink, she had a leather thong around the thing's throat that did nothing but anger it and make its head bow. And that gave the hound space to snap the iron back over one of the shutters. The sound of wood slamming home was a relief nobody wanted to show aloud. Jon lifted his sword and stopped, the point aimed at not killing but at instruction. He pressed the steel into the Wight's shoulder until it grated bone, until it cut through. The arm came off with an appalling lack of complaint. The arm crawled toward the hearth like a thing that might remember.
Erworv.
Sansa flinched. Jon Royce swore in an Old Vale dialect. The hound kicked the arm into the trough and the skin shriveled and blackened and the smell rose like burned hair and worse. Men choked. Arya's eyes were steady. Bran closed his for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat Jon felt watched by somebody far away. "Fire," Jon said, his voice hoarse. "Dragonglass. These are the only things that end them. Or kill the one that made it," Bran said, his voice bare as a twig. For the first time he looked at Jon. "When the one who turned them dies, they fall." Silence fell like ash that had been waiting. Jon had never liked being an object of attention, but he endured it the way he endured the cold. The Northern Lords were not fools. Two had tears on their faces for which they would never ask forgiveness. Lyanna Mormont pulled her hood down, and there was something in her eyes that would turn to iron given a year. "And you bent the knee to the Dragon Queen," Lord Glover said at last, as if the human argument were the only one that mattered, because in the end it always would be. "I bent the knee to the living," Jon said. "You can call her Targaryen if you like. I call her what we'll need." He slept in a room he had missed without admitting it, where the tapestries smelled of vegetable dyes and honest dust. He woke at the sound of a raven, or rather another sound inside that sound. Sam's laugh, rough with travel and relief, carried down the corridor and made him smile before he could help it. He didn't know until he was in the solar that he had jogged to meet it like a boy late for a lesson. Sam stood there with Gilly on one side and a bundled child in the crook of his arm like a book he cherished. He looked as if his clothes had learned things, too, on the road. "Jon," he said, and then it all spilled out. The cold shocked him and Gilly and the baby, and they were happy to be anywhere that was still and firelit. And the Citadel, gods, the Citadel, and how a boy could drown in a sea of knowledge and never know the shape of the land again. He talked, and Jon let the warmth of it push back the memory of the Wight's tooth. "We should show them," Sam said suddenly. "The Archmesters. They laughed, John. Not all of them, but enough. They were polite about it. There's a kind of arrogance that's gentler than contempt and worse. John studied him. Old Town's a long way. The distance doesn't change what's true. Sam's eyes, always mild even when determined, held a fierceness now that he had won by losing enough times looking for it. Let them look at a thing that doesn't fit into their books. Let them write a new chapter. And he glanced to Gilly and then back to John. Look, it's probably nothing. It's a scrap of writing in a scroll we weren't supposed to be reading. And I might be wrong. I probably am. Say it, John said, because Sam had never hedged an ordinary thing in his life, and if he was hedging this, he must think it extraordinary. It's about Rhaegar Targaryen, Sam said, flinching as if somebody might still be standing in the doorway to scold him. And annulments, and a marriage in secret, not to Elia Martell, to someone else. Rhaegar stood before a septon and... Gilly read it out before I even believed it was important. John, it might mean... His face, that had thinned into something like a man and not a boy, changed with the difficulty of saying. It might mean you're not a bastard. I think we ought to show Bran the passage. He knows things no one else knows. But I won't say more until we're sure. Bran's eyes slid across the fire like reflections on water when John and Sam and Gilly went to him with the news. If they expected wonder or shock, they did not get it. He nodded, his face barely moving, and then he did what he did now, which was leave the room without leaving it. He sat there and John watched him go from them into the dark behind his eyes and felt like a man sitting in a room with a storm moving through the walls. When Bran returned, he breathed. And in that breath there was winter wheat and hot blood and a woman's voice saying a name with more tenderness than the air had any right to hold. Lyanna, Bran said, and John's body had an opinion about the sound of the name that his mind was not yet ready to greet. In a bed of blood. She called him Aegon, he said, and perhaps he looked at John and perhaps he did not. She called you Aegon. John's mouth went dry. The world didn't tilt. It became suddenly very steady in the way a deck becomes steady when the waves die and you realize your legs had been doing work you didn't name. Aegon. He had a bastard stubbornness about names. He had carried Jon Snow like a whetstone that sharpened duty and scraped at joy. You cannot drop the stone and keep the edge. Rhaegar annulled his first marriage, Sam said quickly, gently. He married her, your mother. It makes you, John, it makes you. It makes me alive, John said, and the cinnamon crackle of the fire threw shadows up the wall like birds startled into flight. And it changes nothing. The dead are coming. Sam's face softened into sympathy and disagreement at once. It changes everything and nothing, he said. The Archmesters will listen to a Targaryen king before they listen to a northern bastard. Not that they should, but they will because they're human men with human blindness, and we need every pair of eyes open. John closed his eyes and saw the Wight's fingers crawling toward warmth. He saw Daenerys' hair lift in the wind the way a standard lifts. He saw Sansa's face on the verge between anger and understanding. We leave at first light, he said. Old Town. In the night he dreamed the voice again, not Sam's, not Bran's, not any of the living. He woke with the taste of weirwood in his mouth and went out onto the battlements to stand in the snow. He didn't try to make meaning. Meaning would come for him later, with its knife and its kind hands. Well, town had always been a painting in John's mind. A river, a tower, and 1,000 books that smelled like secrets and damp. It was stranger in truth because it was full of people who believed that books could make the world behave. Gilly's hand stayed in Sam's. Davos kept glancing at the Hound as if to be sure he would not scatter a room full of scholars like pigeons. Archmaester Ibros did not hate them. In some ways that was worse. He received them in a room with winter light and a plainness that seemed like virtue. He asked for their story and listened like a man trimming quills while a child recited a lesson he already knew. We'll show you, John said when the polite skepticism had moved around the room like an unfriendly cat. No more words. It was a lecture hall with stone benches and thin windows. Men with ink on their cuffs rang it like dull jewels. When the Hound set the crate down in the center, some of the older Archmesters leaned forward involuntarily. toward the thing they had spent their lives pretending the world was not like. Ebrose nodded a mild permission. It never changed how it felt when the shutters went up. Fear came the way sunlight comes through a high window on a winter afternoon. It did not warm, but it showed everything without mercy. 3 of the youngest acolytes bolted for the door and returned immediately, too embarrassed not to stand and gape with the rest. A thin archmaester with a voice like a whetstone made a sound like animal terror and bit it, swallowed it, and was polite again. Ebrose watched it move and did not move. "Fire," he said, when the hound kicked the separated hand toward a waiting brazier and it danced once and died. He sounded like a man naming a measure of barley. "And dragonglass." He did not thank them because there are things a man does not thank you for if he is honest. He dismissed the acolytes to fetch quills and ravens. In the yard, where the sun cut the cold cleanly, Sam drew Jon aside. "You ought to know," he said, and he did not have to say the rest. The word ought was heavy enough to have contents. What Bran remembered? "Your name. If it were just a matter of crowns and so on, I wouldn't say it. But Daenerys, she deserves to know what she's sworn herself to and what you've sworn yourself to. You deserve to know. Secrets rot things. They also keep them alive," Davos said easily, arriving with the smell of the harbor on his cloak. "Sometimes long enough to be of use." Jon looked at them and saw the truth in both. He had never wanted to be a riddle. He had made himself a sword. He had always thought the gods, if they were watching, were too busy to enjoy irony. "We tell her after the parley," Jon said. "I can't afford to be anything but what I've been until we face Cersei with an army of living men gathered behind us. If I'm a Targaryen to them now, half of them will spend their breath on old wars instead of the war at the door." Sam nodded reluctantly. "You're not wrong." He looked after Gilly and the baby, who had discovered that a bit of frost on a stone pillar could be persuaded to melt. "The world doesn't wait for us to be ready, but we can ask it to hold still while we find a better grip." They left Old Town under a rash of ravens pointing themselves at every horizon. The Vale received them at the gates of the moon. Winter roads to the Eyrie were a dare older men refused. Lord Yohn Royce met them beneath banners that had been brushed with snow and frozen before the cloth could drink it. On one side of him stood a boy with fine, fragile features and eyes as blue as mirrors. On the other, men who had grown heavy on the patience that keeping a boy alive demanded of a household until he could outgrow his sicknesses or his keepers could outgrow their illusions. "We'll see it," Yohn Royce said simply, before Jon could say more than his name. The Vale was filled with stubborn stones and stories, not fools. They stood in the chilly courtyard where the breath of men and horses steamed alike. The Wight came out of the box and went at the nearest throat with the single-minded innocence of a winter storm. A knight who had laughed scornfully at talk of dead men shattered the laughter with the sound of his own breath. The boy Lord Robin was pasty but stubborn with it, gripping the arm of his chair with white fingers, eyes wide as coins. "Fire," Yohn Royce said, calm as a man watering his stone garden. He watched the demonstration the way he would have watched a new mining tool, assessing not what it was, but what it could be made to do. Afterward, he put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You see," he said gently, "your mother told you the world was soft. It isn't. But it doesn't have to be cruel if your knights hold their line." The Vale promised men. Yohn Royce sent ravens at once for every small lord that could stagger through the snow. He spoke to Jon with the economy of a man who liked his winter nights to belong to him. "The Lannisters won't believe a letter now. If you can show Jaime Lannister himself, he'll believe what's in front of his long nose. He's not a fool. He's just been very loyal to a cause he can't afford to see clearly." "You know him," Jon said. "I know men who know him," Yohn answered, which was Vale practical. "And Bronze Yohn knows what honor looks like on an enemy. It looks the same." They moved across the bottom of the world like a slow fire. At the crossroads, a gaggle of riverlords arrived with their hats in their hands and the smell of Lannister coin in their worries. They saw the Wight in the stable yard with the dung and the warm steam of horseflesh around it, and a few of them vomited politely into hay and called for wine. The others set their jaws and asked where to send their sons. When they said the twins were close to them, too many Freys alive or dead and not enough truth among them, Jon suggested Raventree. A Blackwood never needed convincing that winter meant something. Brienne found them there. She came like a single bright spear in a field of dull spears, and her face, honest, beautiful with the kind of beauty that doesn't care to be named, broke into relief when she saw Sansa's letter in Jon's hand and heard him say her name. The hound made a sound that could have been a laugh and might have been his ribs shifting. "You still breathing, woman? Better than you?" she returned, all flint and courtesy. "I'm on my way to King's Landing. Lady Sansa bade me go for her. The Parley. Come stand in a circle with fools," the hound muttered. He gestured to the crate. "And look in the mouth of a bigger fool." She did not flinch when they opened it. She did not flinch when it surged. She put one big hand on a young lord's shoulder and steadied him with the same infinite kindness with which she would have straightened a tilting stool. "Fire," she said afterward, jaw set. "Fire and truth and a line of men that won't break." In the Stormlands, the winter was a rumor rather than a king. The green of the pines looked like wealth after all the white. Gendry moved through it as if his father's ghost had chosen his stride for him. At Evenfall Hall, Lord Selwyn Tarth met them with all the courtesy a true lord keeps even in a lean season. He put his hand on Brienne's head, a father's touch that turned her briefly into a girl again and made the hound look away in embarrassment for feeling it. Selwyn listened as if this, at last, were a story worth the telling, and then he stood and saw it done. House Tarth would send men and food and fairies. Brienne would go on to King's Landing and stand between Lies and Sansa with her height and her truth. At Nightsong, a Karen widow in a dress mended cleanly at the elbows watched the White Nash and said in a voice that must have been used to saying no to men, "We will stand. I have boys who own their swords and girls who know how to pull a bow. We will stand." Gendry went alone to Storm's End with Davos's name on a letter and Davos's trick of speaking, as if you had already agreed to it. He didn't lie about his father. He didn't know how to. He said Robert had been a great hammer of a man who loved his friends and broke everything else. He said the dead were worse than any king. He set the White's hand on a table and watched as the steward ran 5 steps before remembering he was not meant to run. "I won't ask you to follow me," he said to a circle of men who looked like salt and stone. "I'll ask you to follow the living." In the Reach, they went to Horn Hill because there are lines that pull a man whether he wants them or not, and Sam followed his to the door he had left like a problem unsolved. Melissa Tarley was difficult to surprise, but she took a step toward her son when he came into the hall in a way that made it painfully clear she had not expected to be allowed to choose it. Tala, round-faced with a will under it, set down the tray she was carrying and stared at Gilly with all the interest a sister reserves for a woman who has survived a Tarley and learned to laugh about it. They opened the crate in the stable so as not to put the house at risk. Melissa's hand went to her throat and then slowly down and away as a lady recovered her balance. She didn't scream. She cursed very softly, as one curses when one's embroidery snags on a bit of nail and ruins an hour's work. "Your father would have called this nonsense," she said to Sam afterward as they all warmed their hands. He would have gone red about the ears and called it treason and witchcraft and anything else he needed to make himself right. "He's Ash." For a moment grief gripped the line of her mouth and let go. "He's Ash and so is your brother and the world is not kinder because of it. I can cook a better stew than any man you've brought me, and I cannot bring my dead to breakfast again. But if this is true, and I say it is, then I'm no use to the world fussing in a kitchen. Take the stores. Take the men. Leave me enough to keep the household from falling in on itself and go." Tala pressed a spoon into Gilly's hand and whispered to her as if they had always been sisters. Sam stood between them like a tree that had made it through a storm. He had no right to survive and looked for the first time like a son any house would have been glad to call theirs. Jon watched them and felt the breath move through him slowly. They took the thing to Old Town once more by way of the High Tower, because the Citadel's ravens had ceded the sky and Jon had the stubbornness left in him to insist. Leighton Hightower was out of sight in his queer rooms dreaming of winds. But his son met them in the yard and leaned forward with all the fierce curiosity his father had starved in him. "If the dead are coming, we'll light Hightower's beacon," the man said, jaw working. "We haven't in 100 years. If the light makes any fool safer than he is in the dark, we do it." Dorne was both farther and nearer than it had ever been in Jon's mind. The desert tasted of metal and winter grit ground between the teeth. At Skirich, Lord Fowler's mother took a chair, as if she sat to outwait the end of the world, and watched the demonstration in silence. At Ironwood, Lord Anders's courtiers murmured in a not-quite language of sibilance and sense. Yora, his father's son, held his shoulders as if it didn't matter to him whether they sneered or bowed. They stopped sneering when the Wight dragged itself over a swept tile floor with an animal insistence, and the youngest Ironwood vomited into his sleeve and stood with it and lifted his chin. "We have salt," Lord Anders said softly, sounding like he wanted to cut it to see how the grain lay. "We have sand. We have old blood. We'll send you men who can march a week on a memory." Starfall was a surprise. The Danes were a soft word in a room of hard ones. They received Jon with the courtesy due a Stark who had once been nearly cut in two by a knight of their house. The word art. Her was a knife and a lullaby at once in the room's air. They watched the Wight's blackened tongue, and the young Lady Dane held a candle close to its face with a scientist's cruelty, and then she frowned. "We believed the wrong songs," she said, and blew out the candle. The Iron Islands were worst because the Wight stank like a wet rope and fish, and the Ironborn did not fear what they could hold underwater. The Hound had trouble with the deck under his feet and stared too long at the horizon with a memory in his mouth like ashes. Theon was no one's favorite ghost. At Harlaw, Roderick the Reader looked up from a book that could have been older than the language of it and fixed a long gaze on the crate, then on Theon, then on Jon. "I don't love your gods," Roderick said after he had watched the Wight claw at its bonds and watched Theon not run. "I don't love any man's gods, but I love what men can hold when they think they're about to break. I will give you ships. I will give you men who know how to burn what must be burned." "Euron?" Jon asked. Roderick's mouth twisted. "He is a madness that is proud of his name. He's not a king. He's a calamity that learned how to dress. We won't unmake him with prayer. We cut his ropes where we can and let the wind do the rest." Back on the mainland, Tyrion's message found them. He had seen Jaime at a half-ruin sept in the Westerlands where there were fewer ears. Bronn had laughed himself into a stomachache and told anyone who would listen that the last man to stand in the way of a Lannister family quarrel, who wasn't a Lannister, had ended up poorer and shorter. The meeting would happen, but Jaime would come with as few eyes on him as possible and no red cloaks. "He'll see it," Tyrion had written in a hand that looked tired. "He will not enjoy seeing it. That may help." Jaime wore plain leather when he came up the narrow road to a shepherd's fold Tyrion had chosen precisely because no god had ever looked down at it and claimed it for a story. He dismounted like a man made partly of habit and partly of scars. When he turned and saw Jon, he looked for a moment more like his sister than Jon had ever seen, and then he looked nothing like her at all. Tyrion stayed back, as if being near his brother still hurt his ribs. The Hound spat as if to mark the ground. "You used to talk to me like you knew my name," he said conversationally to Jaime. "It's Clegane, not dog. You can use either if you like. I've seen worse mouths than yours." Jaime did not rise to it. His eyes were not contemptuous. They were full of a calculation he could not help doing, even now. "Show me," he said. They did. He stood close, because there must be a part of him that believed he could not be turned aside by anything a peasant kept in a box. When the Wight came for him, he did what any good knight does when a thing without honor challenges him. He moved faster than a man who has lost his right hand has any business moving. He lifted his stump to protect his throat out of old habit, then cursed softly at the uselessness of it and stepped aside like a dancer, and the thing went sprawling on the dirt. He could have let someone else kick it. He did it himself, with a savagery that showed exactly how many dead he had made with a sword and how much he hated it now. When it was over, there was a quiet in him. He sometimes looked like a man built in a room full of swords. Now he looked like a man who had walked out of that room and couldn't forgive himself for how many swords he'd needed to get to the door. "You'll tell Cersei," Tyrion said softly, from the edge of the circle. "You'll tell her truth." "I will tell her what I saw," Jaime said. "She will hear what she needs to hear in it, and then she will say something daring and clever and wrong. And he stopped. His jaw worked. I have done wrong for a woman I loved. I will not do wrong for her again, not for this. He looked at Jon, and there was respect in it and dislike and recognition. I will keep my word in the Dragonpit. If she tries to break hers, I will leave her. You'll die, the Hound said with no particular interest. Perhaps, Jaime said. So will you, so will we all. It would be a pity to do it for the wrong cause. King's Landing smelled the same as always, which was to say like everything that has ever lived and been squeezed together and made to rot politely. The Dragonpit rose out of the city like a broken bowl. They walked into it through a corridor of soldiers who had dust on their boots and suspicion in their eyes. The Wight's box weighed less than fear and more than some of them would admit. Cersei sat like a picture of a queen borrowed from a better book. Euron wore the kind of grin men wear when they have decided that the only good joke is the one that cuts someone else's throat. Qyburn's eyes were small and full of light not his own. Brienne stood without apology. Sansa had sent her truth ahead. The world had already been moved a few inches. They made their speeches and Jon said fewer words than any of them and better. He felt Daenerys come in the way a storm comes into a field on a close day, all at once and with tribute demanded. She landed on the back of her dragon in the yard outside and came into the pit with her head high and her hair like a standard. Jaime watched her and steeled himself for a kind of jealousy he had no right to and then found it was not there. Tyrion looked at his sister and looked at the ground and looked at the air as if he might find a better family hidden in it. They opened the box. The Wight did its work. This time no one pretended to be above fear. Qyburn's hand trembled when he reached for the severed limb crawling on its own. And he looked up like a boy caught stealing and then didn't care enough to be ashamed. The Hound thrust a torch into the thing's face and it screamed a scream that had never been given to a name. Fire ate it. The sound died.
Euron performe.
D his cowardice like a juggler doing knives. I'm off, he said. I like to keep my teeth where they are. I'd rather fight rocks. Rocks lose honestly. He looked at Daenerys with a lewdness that could drown small dogs. Come on, uncle, he said to Jaime with easy mockery. Jaime did not answer. His eyes were on Cersei. Cersei said words that were almost true. She demanded Jon's promise and thought to trap him with it. Jon gave her the truth because he had made himself a man who could not say the other thing. For once, the truth was not a trap. It was a fuse. I have pledged to Queen Daenerys, he said, and the sound of it echoed in the bones of the pit. There was a movement, a tremor that had nothing to do with stone. Men and women in all the corners of the world heard it as they had heard it in their own halls, and this time it traveled through the air like something stronger than rumor. Cersei's face cracked open and showed the calculation behind it. She threw her refusal like a bone to her hounds. Jaime opened his mouth and closed it and then found the seam of his courage and tore it open with his hands. We fight the dead first, he said, in a voice that did not ask. If you walk away from this, you do it without me. Cersei's rage came like a knife with pearls in the hilt. There was a moment where Jon saw how a man's whole life can come down to the shape of his sister's face when she speaks and to the way his own ribs feel under his mail. Jaime turned and walked away, and Brienne, across the pit, didn't move at all except for something happening in her eyes that meant more than anyone, but she and the gods needed to know. Daenerys watched Cersei's mouth and heard the lie inside the truth. She did not trust, but she did not have to. The world had already seen. The ravens had already flown. The Manderleys had already opened their granaries. Tyrell bannermen who had once worn roses and now wore grief were already marching north with spears polished that morning against armor that had belonged to their fathers. Dorne's men were already moving like a whisper through the Boneway. Ships out of the Iron Islands were already knifing through the Slate Ocean to cut Euron's lines, silent as guilt. When they came out into the light, Jon felt like a man who had been holding his breath underwater and had finally made a small hole in the ice and got a mouthful of air. Daenerys stopped him with a hand on his arm. It was a small hand. He had not known how much a small hand could weigh. After, he said quietly, after this, there's something you need to hear after this. She studied him. She had learned to mistrust the words of men who said they had something to tell her later. After, she said, and the word was a thin bridge they both agreed not to burn. North, the world tightened and hardened. In Winterfell, Arya and Sansa faced Littlefinger in a hall that now knew with absolute clarity what the enemy looked like. Sansa spoke like a woman who had untaught a girl the wrong lessons. Arya held a blade that did not forgive. Bran recited truth as if reading the label on a jar of poison. The man who had spent his life teaching others to distrust the exact thing he had nowhere to put his hands. He died like a man who could not believe it and perhaps could not. The floor was wiped clean. The ravens roost heavy on the battlements. The air full of wing and rumor and purpose. Jaime rode north alone with a face that would not look at anyone for fear of catching their gaze and seeing a reflection he could not bear. He camped under hedges, and sometimes a farmer's boy looked at him and saw a knight, and sometimes a girl looked at him and saw a man, and sometimes an old woman looked at him and saw only another traveler chasing his own breath through the cold. When he crossed the neck, the wind changed in his nose, and he knew the winter's breath in earnest. It was an honest smell. He preferred it. The wall groaned. Even before the sky turned an unkind color, men with old scars in old places woke at night and put their hands to their faces as if to be sure they still had lips to pray with. Eastwatch had sent ravens. Tormund's laugh had gone out under a waste-white sky with a sound like a horn that no one could find the end of. "We are ready," the ravens told the castles and the keeps and the halls and the hovels. "We are ready and we are not ready, and both will have to do." The first contingents came into Winterfell like veins filling. Vale Lords set camp with the precision of men who'd built walls for storms before this. River Lords arrived with wagons that creaked and smelled of apples and old blood. Dornish men stepped gingerly on snow for the first time and smiled. Their thin scarves a joke the North forgave them for because they had come. The Hound stood by the fire and did not look at it and passed cups of soup to boys who would have otherwise shaken their hands to pieces. Lyanna Mormont organized 100 things no one had thought to do yet, and then went out into the yard and practiced with her spear without apology. Sansa moved through it all like a woman keeping a household that had suddenly become an army, which is to say with a constant shedding of small comforts for the sake of a larger one. Daenerys came on dragonback when the wind was knife-keen and cruel. Drogon's wings carved space that seemed solid. The North looked up and remembered that in its stories dragons were always something that belonged to the wrong side of a tale. Then they saw Jon lift his hand to the Queen as if to steady her and saw her hawk gaze soften a fraction when it met his, and they set aside the old songs because men had always written more when the truth outpaced them. In the Godswood, Jon found Daenerys sitting with her gloves in her lap, her bare hands together as if she could make warmth by holding it between her palms. The heart tree had nothing to say but the old story it always told in red on white. The air smelled of iron and something like apples that never would be. "I was raised here," Jon said when it became clear that the gods were content to listen without offering counsel. "I learned to shoot a bow badly here." He smiled without looking at her. "I kissed a girl here as a boy and thought the world would come apart because of it. It didn't. With me it often does," Daenerys said, a little dry. Then the dryness went. "Tell me what you said you would tell me." He did. He did it without speeches and set the words down like tools. Rhaegar, annulment, Lyanna, marriage, a name given in a room full of blood and love, a boy carried out of it and buried under another man's name. He did not say what it made him because the word stuck in his mouth like a fishbone and because he did not care, not the way men were meant to care. He cared about the line of men between here and the wall and the light running out. She grew very still. He had thought that the word would turn her to iron. It did not. It turned her into a woman thinking about a house she had built on a hill that might be sand. And she did not love the hill because she loved it. She loved it because she had built it. "If it's true," she said at last, and he could tell she already knew it was, "then you have a claim." "I have a duty," Jon said. "We can sort the other thing when there's a world left to do it in." He made himself look at her. "I don't want it. I don't want it. I have never wanted it." She watched him, and in her eyes there was something like pain and something like relief and something like fear. "Men who do not want power often do not do the harm with it that men who do want it do," she said softly. "My whole life has been for this, and I cannot say I do not want it. But I do not want it if it means burning down the house I meant to shelter people in. We need to show the world we are not two houses at war with each other while the dead watch and smile, Jon said. We need to show them what we have already shown them. We stand together and do not break. She nodded. She did not take his hand because there are things that are true whether a hand is taken or not. She stood and looked up into the tree's face. I was meant to burn my enemies, she said to the white wood. I think I am meant now to warm my friends. The difference is smaller and larger than I knew. They drilled and they dug. They melted what could be melted and wrote names on the rest. The Wight's box sat to one side of a yard like an empty gallows. The hound threw his cloak over it and said nothing when a boy used it as a bench to mend a boot. But later he kicked it once, hard, without anger, because sometimes a man must do that to an old fear to keep it small. On a night of thin stars a horn sounded far and mean. Men are animals that understand when a note means hunger and when it means wolves. They woke and stood and moved to where they had been told to go. The dead came like a weather front, not a line but a shifting field of presence. The first ranks made no noise but their feet, a sound like old paper on a stone floor, and then there were the sounds men make when they die at the hands of a thing that has no hands in the proper sense. It was not a battle in the way songs like their battles. It was work, ugly and pious. It was a line that sagged and did not break. The veil held. The riverlands bent and did not break. Dorne moved like water over ice, flexible, cutting. The reach planted and reaped with scythes of light and fire. Manderley's men showed fat men can move when the winter is inside the belly as well as out. Lyanna Mormont disappeared into the trouble the way a child disappears into a game and reappeared covered in just enough blood that someone took her by the shoulders and walked her back and made her drink hot wine. She cried from frustration and the wine's heat and nobody told anyone. Jaime's golden hand shone and did nothing, and he led with his body instead. Brienne led with her height and her voice and her unbreakability, which the men around her borrowed like a cloak. Tyrion found that fear makes a man intelligent because he cannot afford to be anything else. Davos moved between fires and put coals in the right places and a word in the right ear and saved 3 men who would never learn his name. Theon stood on a wall and did not run and did not die that night. He slept afterward like a man whose body had finally decided he could borrow it for another day. At dawn the dead fell back a little but not enough to feel like victory. They tarried, if tarrying is something dead things can do. The light took them and did not change them. The living counted and found numbers shaped like a wound and moved from one end of the wound to the other with needle and thread. Jon slept 2 hours with his boots still on and woke to the sound of a voice speaking no tongue he knew until the syllables shaped themselves into something that had been his mother's breath when he was a pile of blood and name in a cold room. Bran came to him like a vibration in the air. "The Night King," he said, and the words turned the wind colder. "He is moving to a place he will know. He will want to break the place inside us that remembers being safe. He will go to the Godswood." "Then so do we," Jon said, already moving as if he had been waiting his whole life to move exactly like this. He found Daenerys and told her the plan and did not dress it as anything other than a risk disguised as courage. "We lure him," he said. "We cut the head. If Bran is right, the body will follow." Bran's mouth bent with that slight resemblance to a smile he now wore when terrible things were at hand. "I am right," he said, and if he had been any other boy, someone would have hit him for the arrogance of it. Jon felt the gratitude bite his throat. Truth was a mercy in aught but its timing. At twilight, the Godswood was a place made of silence. The snow fell as if trying to remember how to do it gently. Bran sat beneath the weirwood in his chair, a boy who was also a door standing open. Arya sat at his shoulder and looked like another kind of door with a different idea about who should walk through it. The hound's presence put a different taste in the air. It smelled of burned bread and stubbornness. Sansa stood at the edge of the snow where the path began, not meant to fight here and understanding the cruelty of that as a woman who had long since ceased to believe cruelty was a surprise. She touched Jon's sleeve without making a speech of it. He met her eyes and saw the girl and the Lady of Winterfell in a single glance and ached with the pride that has nothing to do with crowns. Daenerys stood last. Drogon crouched behind her like a hill that had grown impatient. Rhaegal was a green shadow above the treetops. Yora took his place with the men in the second rank and did not look at her, because sometimes all a man needs to do to look at a woman is stand with his back to her and know she is there. The Night King came without fanfare. The snow's hush turned into a sound you could feel with your teeth. Cold humming. The dead moved through the trees with an annoyance for obstacles that was almost comedic and somehow made it worse. He stepped into the clearing, and for a moment Jon thought he would lift a hand and the weirwood would wither. He did not. He looked, and that was worse. Jon had told himself he would not look into the Night King's face, as if by doing so he would give something up. He failed. The face was a blade cut from the night, not the sky. The night that chickens make when the fox is already inside. The night that hangs between breaths in a birthing room. He looked at Bran and did not bother looking at the rest of them. Everything that followed happened at once and then in pieces, remembered out of order by the living. Rhaegal came down with a sound that was nothing but air abused and unrepentant. The Night King stepped back, because even a king does not put himself under claws if he can help it. Arrows went like a single voice spoke them and stuck and did nothing. And then one went where it should not have been able to, and the White Walker at the Night King's flank fell into glitter and gone. The Whites nearest it halted as if embarrassed and collapsed. A sudden hole in the enemy muscle that made men cheer and then choke on their cheers as the night moved to fill itself. The Night King raised his hand. The dead rose in answer, and the living felt the space around their hearts tighten. Jon moved, a speed he didn't think belonged to him. His sword, Valyrian fire captured in iron, met a blade of pure winter. The sound was wrong. It was the sound of a stone that had never meant harm suddenly doing harm to a man's skull. Jon's body remembered every lesson every hard man had ever driven into it and used all of them. He did not die. He did not win. Daenerys did not wait. Her word to Drogon was a syllable he had learned from her heart rather than her tongue. Fire hammered the clearing, and the Night King took it like rain. He turned and looked at her the way a boy looks at the horse he means to break. Yora yelled something that could have been her name or anyone's. Jon's sword bit shallowly into a place that felt like killing and did not kill. The Night King moved like the end of a story. It was Arya's knife that decided the tale. It was always going to be Arya's knife, which is not to say anyone had the right to know it. She came from nowhere and everywhere. A light shock of moving air. The Night King caught her because he had hands for that and broke her trajectory because he had broken many things. The knife dropped and fell into her other hand because she had been practicing dropping and catching since before she remembered why. She put it where she had been told, in a room where men had never been, and it went home. The world held its breath and then let it out so fast it doubled over. The dead fell as if pardoned from a sentence they had not asked for. The silence that followed was the silence in a tent after the screaming stops and a baby breathes. For a moment no one believed it. Then the hound laughed. A short, ugly bark of a sound, and the laughter turned into a sob fast enough to make him angry at himself. He stumped away toward the fire he hated. Jon stood breathing like a man who has outrun his own death and needs to find another to replace it. He found Daenerys instead. She was looking at the place where the Night King had stood, and at Arya with her knife like an extension of her arm, and at Bran who had not moved at all. Then she looked at Jon. He looked back, and they stood there and acknowledged with a single glance the shelves in their rooms where crowns sat, and the tables where no supper had been eaten, and the fields where men had done the small hard work of living without complaint while kings burned and froze and turned to ash. It did not end there, because nothing ever does. There were dead to count. There were names to say, and some of them were said in rooms where no one wept because weeping would break the fragile crust over the sea of it and drown them all. Jaime stood with his head bowed, and Brienne stood beside him and allowed her hand to brush his sleeve once without either of them needing to make something of it. Sansa sat with a quill and signed field orders as if she had been born at a desk, which in a way she had. Tyrion walked the yards and talked with men who had once thought him a joke and did not any longer, and that was not triumph but something like usefulness, which he preferred. Euron's ships burned on a sea that reflected nothing but its own cold light. Roderick Harlaw watched them through a lens and noted in a book the way fire eats rope and the way some knots hold longer than others even when gods do not. In the Reach, Melissa Tarley oversaw the filling of wagons bound north with the laziness of a gentlewoman who has never worked a day in her life while knowing exactly how many sacks go on before a wheel breaks. In Dorne, Anders Ironwood stood with his hands behind his back and did the arithmetic of men and miles and thought for the first time in a long time that he might teach his children a song that did not end in blood. In the morning, such as it was, Jon found Daenerys on the battlements with her hair undone by the wind. He stood beside her. They watched the world. It was not, no matter how his heart insisted, waiting for them to speak. "If we live," she said finally, "the question of rule will still live too." Jon said. He had learned that little word could be a bridge. "We can choose not to make war over it. We can choose not to be songs. They will not let us choose alone," she said, and there was no self-pity in it. Only knowledge. "The lords will come and bring their fathers' eyes and their grandfathers' grudges. They will ask us to take sides they invented when they were boys." He thought of a small woman with a spear telling a room full of old men what they would do. He thought of a woman in a kitchen telling him to take the men and the food and leave enough to keep the house standing. He thought of a girl who had killed the dead. He thought of a boy who had gone into the winter inside his mind and returned with a world in his mouth. "Then we show them again," he said. "We show them what we have showed them since Dragonstone. That we put the living first. That we share the weight. That we don't break." She looked at him, and there was a softness the wind could not move. "You are a man who would make a poor king by choice and a good one by accident," she said, the faintest hint of a smile. "I am a woman who would make a fierce queen by design and a worse one if I am left alone with my mind. We could do worse than to let those truths hold hands." He did not take her hand. He didn't have to. They stood while the sun hauled itself over the edge of a world that had not ended and looked smaller because of that effort. Behind them, men cleaned armor and women counted jars of fat and children, because there were still children, played at fighting in lines and went to their mothers when they fell. The snow fell lightly as if practicing mercy. The gods would held its red tongues still, tasting. Far south, a woman with gold in her hair and a dead thing's patience calculated how many years she could keep breathing on a chair made of swords and lies. She had not seen the dead in the way others had seen them. She had not breathed fear the way others had. She would not learn easily. That was a problem for tomorrow and every day after. It was a problem men and women of the living had earned the right to consider by the labor of their lungs. The ravens that left Winterfell that day flew with a different weight to their wings than the ravens that had flown before. They carried not just warning but a beginning. Jon went to the yard. The men put away their fear with their armor and drew it out again when the day called for it. He thought of the Wight in the box and the long road at its side. He thought of the way men had looked when the shutters went up, and the way they had looked when they shut again. He thought that men are boxes. He thought that it was good to open them carefully. He picked up a practice sword, and a boy with ears that stuck out and a name too big for him came at him grinning. Jon parried and let the boy win and did not tell him so. There are lies a man is allowed. There are truths he is required to spend. He had spent a great deal of truth and still had enough in him for a few more winters if he was lucky. He looked up and saw the queen on the wall and did not know whether she would be his death or his life. He knew she would be his work. He knew he would be hers. When the sun finally sheared itself free of the cloud and the day hurt the eyes with brightness on snow, men raised their hands to shade their sight and smiled despite their grief. They were not kings. They were not queens. They were the living. They had seen what ought never to have been seen, and because of it they would eat and sleep and make vows and break some and keep others and bury their dead and speak their names until they ran out of breath. They had been shown and they would not forget. Winter had come. It would go. The box stood empty in the corner of the yard, its iron banding cold to the touch. The hound scowled at it as he passed and rubbed the scar at his jaw. "I'll make a chicken coop of you yet," he told it. Then, to the boy with ears who heard him and giggled, he growled, "You think that's funny? Go haul wood, you little shit." The boy ran, still laughing. The sound of it struck the walls and bounced and returned changed but still laughter. Down in the kitchens, steam rose in long sighs. Up on the battlements, the wind wrote its old uncompromising letters. In the Godswood, the tree kept its secrets and shared what it chose with those whose hands were steady on its roots. The world did what it has always done. Spun, thickened towards spring, kept its watch, and in it a man named one thing and another, and a woman named one thing and another, and a great many others named less and more, took a breath and the air went in and out again, and that was what it was to be alive.